it's not just about changing the conversation. It's about changing the goal of the conversation. It's not just about trying to be right or trying to prove somebody wrong, but it's about seeking to understand, seeking to learn, and seeking to grow. And when that's the objective of our conversation, that's when everybody starts to win.
If you don't understand, don't misunderstand. And a lot of people, when they don't understand, they already draw their conclusion or make assumptions that their perception of what they understood is the reality. If we're not trying to be right or trying to make somebody else wrong, but we're seeking clarity, that's where the bridge can actually be crossed.
All right, welcome to It's Not So Black and White. Myself, Sir John, the legendary Canadian, along with Lamar. I wanted him to be Lamar the legendary, but he's settling. His legendary life begins next year, he said.
Yeah, I think I got one more year on that.
One more year until you cross over the big 50, and then you're officially a living legend. And we have a very special guest tonight who was formerly Barack Obama on Twitter, but he doesn't bear a striking physical resemblance. He's not actually his twin. But Caleb, thank you so much for joining us tonight. And how about I'll give you the mic and let you share a little bit of what you do and why we decided to have you here.
Yeah, sounds good. It's great to be here. Day job, I will say, is being a father first. I'm a father of 3 kids, so taking them to school, picking them up from school, doing all the father things. Beyond that, I run an innovation consulting firm called 18 Coffees that really focuses on the intersection of strategy and change management, really. I mean, talking about how do you operate in a new world, and then how do you actually build organizations that can operate in a new world. But we really care about things like ethical innovation, ethics in tech, sustainability, a lot of the big social issues that are at the intersection of business and doing good right now. Some really, really interesting work being done that we get to be a part of every day. Beyond that, I do a fair amount of writing and speaking and, being a generally somewhat, smart guy online and in person as much as I can be.
Well, that's awesome. And I love that you said you're a father first. It's really interesting. I like to listen to language that people use and kind of how they frame things. And so when you say that, I think it speaks to your character already. So I really appreciate that. I'm awfully curious where the name 18 Coffees comes from. Is that like how many you drink in a day, or?
I do drink an absurd amount of coffee a day, so there's some truth there. My business partner does as well. But funny story about the name is when we were trying to start the company. If you've ever named anything important like a company or a child, you'll know that, picking the right name is this asinine exercise in self-loathing where you're like, why are we even doing this? Everything is terrible. We can't agree on anything. So my business partner and I went through that exercise for the name of the company for months and months. And finally, I was like, you know what? It doesn't matter what we call the name. Like, we're going to have to teach people what we do as a company anyway. What really matters is that there's a website free. Let's be honest. Like, we need to be able to have a website. So you just give me a number. I'm going to give you a flavor of ice cream. If we don't hate it, we're just going to pick that and we're going to run with it. And my business partner is Chinese by origin. So 18 is a lucky number in Chinese culture. Okay. I was on a coffee ice cream binge. Still love coffee ice cream. Neither of us hated it. And I was like, fine, I'm buying the website. That's it. We're not going to keep debating about this. So that's how we came up with the name.
Now, what I love about that, there's 2 things. One, there's a story behind it. So that story is going to stick with me. Stories have the power of kind of being sticky in our brain, but it also creates curiosity, intrigue right away. It's a great conversation starter, just like right now. I'm like, where did that name come from? And how does that tie into ethical innovation? And so for ordinary, I shouldn't say ordinary listeners out there, but we don't necessarily use a term like ethical innovation in sort of day-to-day syntaxes. I'm like trying to use ordinary words here too. in everyday conversation. There we go. And so what, when you say ethical innovation, what are you sort of picturing here for an average listener?
Well, I think it takes an optimistic perspective that we can use the levers of capitalism, if I can, use a word that tends to trigger my progressive friends. We can use business tools and we can use innovation and coming up with new ideas to still do good if we actually consider the social impacts of how we bring things to market. I mean, that's what it comes down to. Is I'm all about moving fast. I just don't necessarily want to do the break things part, because what we end up breaking is democracy half the time. Looking at you, Mark
Yep.
Zuckerberg. But you know, like, I still think coming up with new ideas is like the engine of how our economy grows. I think it's exciting. People want to be a part of bringing new things into the world. I just think we increasingly need to bring new things into the world that are for everyone, not just for a few.
I mean, interesting that you say that, because in discussing what everyone looks like, so that's a big blanket term. So when things go out there, like for everyone, you know, people from my background, people from the African American community, people from Hispanic community may not feel that the things that are being brought to market actually meets them where they are. So what are some of the things that you may introduce to us, or to companies rather, that really draws them to really create something that speaks to everyone in a way that won't compromise their product, but at the same time will meet the market that they want to reach it in whatever area they're trying to focus on?
Yeah, well, we're working on one project right now that I'm thinking about, where we're really talking about what are the both direct and indirect impacts of bringing this product to market. Like, what are the things? Who are the users this is for? How do we define that in a way that is not as black and white as it typically, user research is done, right? We usually draw boundaries. We're like, we want 35-year-old soccer moms from the suburbs, like that's how in my career, that's how market research has been defined for me. And what we found is that we can create hypotheses about the people that may be attracted to the product, may use the product, but inevitably there are people that use it in creative ways we didn't expect. There are populations that use it that we didn't expect. So part of it is developing the right feedback mechanisms right away. But the other thing is, I think we've created in the innovation space an MVP culture that is very monotonous. Like, it is very, like, when we say MVP, what we really mean is MVP for rich white people. Like, that becomes the code. It's like, we want an MVP for the people that we know have the kinds of pockets we want, that live in the kinds of areas we want. And it becomes this shorthand for privilege. I mean, it just really does. So just being aware of that, building those kinds of like self-reflection mechanisms into the design process up front. So when we create a minimum viable product, we're actually defining viable in a very different way than it has been defined.
Okay.
So you mentioned that capitalism might trigger, I don't know if you said trigger, but to some of your more progressive friends. And I think that's a really interesting statement to make, because here's something we've been wrestling with as well. And it's a shame that Chris isn't here, because she has a cultural anthropology background. And
interesting. She and I'll do a separate podcast. We'll do one together.
Absolutely. I'll make sure I make that connection. Because do we really have capitalism right now, or do we have some kind of sort of, I don't want to use the term fascist, but I'm just thinking of like the merger between corporation and state. There seems to be a very, very close collaboration between, corporation and state, which is actually more the definition of fascism than maybe the way that gets thrown about in social media. And it's like, do we actually have something closer to that model of governance than actual true capitalism or free market capitalism? I'll start with that question, I guess. We'll put it there.
Well, I think that might be a pretty extreme way to describe it, but I get what you're getting at, which is what's corporate influence on democracy and vice versa. I mean, I think what's true is that democracy in the States, of course, as I'm defining it, and capitalism both need markets. And right now, both of those markets are not mutually exclusive. They definitely influence each other, sometimes for the better, sometimes for the worse. I think that I definitely would take the perspective that there's too much money in politics. And I think I would take the perspective that often our government actually shelters parts of the market from true free market competition, right?
Right.
I think both of those things actually can be good things, but are often not used for good. And I think that unrestrained influence on both sides is a bad thing. And right now we have sectors of the market, we have sectors of the government where the influence of each is unrestrained and it needs to be boxed in. I think that when capitalism can be appropriately, Elizabeth Warren talks about this, when capitalism, she's one of the most progressive members of Congress. She's also a huge capitalist. Like she's comes from, Harvard Business School, I believe, or Harvard Law School, but she taught a lot about free market economics. And she talks about how, like, when competition works like it's supposed to work, capitalism is a beautiful thing. But right now we don't have, Scott Galloway talks about how we have socialism for the rich and capitalism for the poor, right? Like we protect those who are wealthy at the expense of those who can't afford it.
And maybe, and I agree with you. Maybe to use the term fascism is a little bit extreme, and I wasn't trying to be inflammatory, but just suggest that there's maybe a closer connection that I'm comfortable with that seems to be, we could pick on, is it Vanguard or BlackRock? Anyways, one of these large investment firms that has, say, $9 trillion in assets under management and is currently vacuuming up real estate. And you go, who can compete with that? Because there's only two economies in the world that are larger than $9 trillion, let alone an individual. And you think, are we moving this direction where, for example, home ownership is going to be out of, that used to be like one of the American dreams. Is that going to become out of reach because these hedge or these capital management firms are just basically buying at 20 to 50% above market value to collect assets to, and so on.
In an already really stressed out real estate market.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's out of reach already, because on one hand, you have businesses and companies, like you just said, that have $9 billion in assets and are buying up things. But at the other time, on the other side of that, you have the government who they're jumping in and starting to regulate so many things to where, the question does come up, is it really capitalism? Because now the government is trying to regulate so many different areas of buying and purchasing. And then you have your top 1% or even your top 2% controlling a large percentage of that. And they're getting breaks through government legislations. So in that place, really calls into question, what type of government are we really operating in? Because in reality, if you break it down, especially by class, by race, and in a lot of cases, even by gender, even in terms of equal pay, when it comes to buying houses, when it comes to overinflating prices for one group that you wouldn't for another, and even what I call mental insecurity, where you don't have the knowledge, or a group of people may not have the knowledge to navigate the markets or navigate the system. So they're more likely to be taken advantage of. So I think that capitalism really has to be relooked at, reworked, and really considered, whether it's benefiting, again, everybody.
Yep, I agree with that.
So my inclination is, and you've had much, especially in the American market, and you spent some time working under President Obama's administration, which I have some just, I guess, questions around that out of pure curiosity. But you look at the system. So you had someone like Barack Obama, which kudos for electing a president under 50, let alone under 70. I wanted to applaud that.
It feels like a long time ago now that we've had two of the oldest presidents we've ever had in a row.
Yeah. But you can install someone like, I shouldn't say install, it's not really the word, but so someone like Barack Obama moves into the position. He's relatively young, he's relatively progressive, forward looking, but is the system itself almost immovable? I don't want to use that term necessarily, but it feels like you can install the most progressive person into that system, but because there's so many parts of it, they're so deeply entrenched that how do you even shift that and start making a move on it?
Well, I think what you're hinting at is that electing a president is not the end all be all of changing the direction of the country. And I think that I was actually in Chicago the night he was elected and got to go to his inauguration, or not his inauguration speech, his acceptance speech. And it was an amazing time, and the hope in the atmosphere and feeling like the country was changing directions. I mean, it was great. And I think that he was always very pragmatic about, I can't do this alone. I'm going to need, lots of people helping. I'm going to need people who are elected, people who are not elected. I'm going to need people marching in the streets, et cetera, et cetera. He was always very pragmatic about it. But the expectations that were put on his shoulders from the beginning were unrealistic, right?
Probably astronomical, because
I mean, but both because of him as a person can't be, no one can carry the burden of those expectations, but also because of the system that the president is able to influence is always, it's bigger in some ways, but in so many ways, the president can't influence the things that people think that they can influence. I mean, look at the spot that we're in right now in the country with gas prices and inflation that are hammering it at President Biden's approval rating. President only has so much influence over either of those things. So, you know, we don't give the president credit in areas like foreign policy when we're, you know, dealing with things like war in Ukraine, even though he has to deal with those things. But we also want him to deal domestically with things where he actually doesn't have very much influence, or he's hamstrung by Congress and other people who, you know, have to. Oh, that was weird. Other people who have to approve the, you know, the budget or other elements of his domestic agenda. So, I think that it takes. What's that old quote about the arc? The arc of the moral history is. I'm butchering this.
Butcher away.
Butcher. You know what I'm. It was a King quote. The arc of justice is long, but what is it?
The arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice.
Yes, thank you.
Martin Luther King. There we go.
Thank you.
I'm not going to pretend that I Googled that while you were thinking.
Yeah, that's some quick Googling. I appreciate it. So we have to look at it as a long game, is what I was trying to get at in terms of changing the system.
Yeah.
It's not going to ever be by electing one person or even a set of people. And it's always going to be slower and more frustrating than people want it to be. But it was built that way, right? Like we designed the American system to be slow and frustrating and not be dominated by the whims of the public at any given moment.
Yeah, no, you know, again, as an outside observer, it's like, so you have the House of Representatives, which is supposed to represent the common people, so to speak, or that was supposed to mirror that element of a governance. The Senate, which I guess in old forms of government would have represented the aristocracy, and the president is in a position sort of similar to what would have been like a monarchy, I guess. Is that what the intention was behind setting up the government as that? So you kind of have the best of three different forms of governance?
Yes, although I think that founding fathers would have taken issue with the president being like a monarchy. I think it's
Fair enough.
More like a combination of a prime minister and you know, it's the head of the executive branch, but I don't think they would have expected it to be like a monarchy, which goes back to my point about the president actually not having a lot of power in certain specific ways.
Yeah, I think that lends to a lot of the discourse that goes on, because I think in believing, and a lot of people tend to fall behind their party and become faithful to their party. And in doing so, it ultimately leads to, whenever your side is elected, you believe that your side is doing everything right and the other side is doing everything wrong. And, you know, that switches within the community. So I think with that being the case, do you see a path even forward for the country to ever operate as it probably was intended to operate, considering that there is always that dividing line which seems to have become greater?
Oh, I'm of two minds about this. I mean, the polling data bears out exactly what you're saying. It's fascinating. Like every 4 years, you know, of Democrats say the economy is going great. Republicans elected, all of a sudden Republicans say the economy is going great, and Democrats say. I mean, it's fascinating, the tribalistic nature of polling data. But I mean, two things I will say. One is I was a history major in college. Always loved history. And, you know, my parents were thrilled. They had no idea what I was going to do with it, but I love studying history. And, you know, the country has always been, why does my webcam keep doing that?
You come through just fine in terms of, we can still hear you.
Yeah. I don't know why it keeps cutting out. I'll keep talking while I process this real quick.
Well, I did throw an invite to Kyle to say he can jump into the con if he happens to be free as well. Because why I thought Kyle would be interested in chatting with you as well is he went from being a Trump voting Republican to
Oh yeah, you told me about this.
quite the other end of the spectrum. And so it's a really interesting arc. And I guess, sorry, I'm hijacking a little bit because you were onto a good thought. But I'm like, I have this question because, again, as an outside observer, sometimes it's just like, so you mentioned like the president doesn't have as much power as we might think he does. So you had a guy like Trump, who I don't think we all laughed about it. We're like, it wouldn't be funny if he got in because we just thought he was a TV entertainer, right? We just were like, this guy's like a TV entertainer kind of thing. So, but when he was in office, of course he was vilified for a lot. But does this mean that, like, was he maybe in the media afforded more power than he actually possessed as well? Or am I missing the mark on that?
Well, there are two things. One is that I think we discovered the power of the presidency to set a cultural narrative. And we saw this in other presidencies as well, but I don't think we saw the negative effects as much as we did during the Trump administration. But the other is that I think we realized how much of the government is run by norms, not rules. It's run by people respecting institutions. It's run by people saying this is the way that this particular process, this procedure is always done, but it was never codified into actual law. And so when you have a person that comes into office that doesn't care anything about norms, and to be honest, in many ways didn't care anything about laws. I mean, there were specific laws that was broken about how the presidency was supposed to be run, including, not using from part of my background, not using, government run social media accounts to do electoral politics. Did that all the time, broke the Hatch Act, a specific law, and not really ever punished for it. So I think we discovered how much of our government is run by norms and how much the enforcement of specific laws really matters to those laws, having any kind of effect. So
I think that when you look at the history of the presidency, the fact that pretty much as you go down the line, go back as far as you go back, though those unwritten laws were just always adhered to. So I think it was a shock to the system to have someone to come in and really just kind of disrupt that. So now you have Congress and you have people who either are for or against. Everybody's pretty much standing around. Okay, right. What do we do? They don't know what to do. And then you add social media into the mix. Imagine George Washington posting on Twitter. It just
well, that goes back to something I was going to tell you earlier when we were talking about are we in a moment right now where we are specifically like more divided than we have been? And I think that there's definitely data points that say that in certain ways we are, and I think that there are other times in the country's history where we have been as divided. Including the Civil War, obviously, maybe the time we were most divided, but like at other times where, there's a specific element in the presidency or in the country that is just really vile. So in certain ways, we're in a very unique moment, especially in the media environment we're in. I think we're in a very unique moment where it's like self-reinforcing, but in other ways, we've had a taste of this before.
Because you work in the field of, is it correct to say you work in the field of digital communication? I mean, I think it's a bit of an oversimplification, but
yeah.
And one that we touched on before we started recording, one of the challenges with digital communication is everything happens so rapidly, and we're in competition for clicks, we're in competition for eyeballs, which means we have to appeal to the fast processing part of the brain, which is not where the logical part of the brain resides. And so we might grapple with, well, why do we live in such an age of like misinformation and disinformation and the raging battle over, where should we draw the lines around censorship and so on and so forth? Because like so much, I guess, revenue in and of itself depends on getting eyeballs onto your content, fact checking can come way later. We kind of have a broken system. Is there any ideas around how we could try to rectify or restore some sort of balance to the system when there's like an appetite or a hunger in the public for like, I want I want to know instantly what's happening in Russia, Ukraine, and so on, versus, can we take one step back and say, okay, what's actually taking place here?
Yeah, I mean, I could talk about that for the entire podcast if you want. I mean, what you're essentially talking about is digital media literacy, right? I mean, there's three pillars that I look at when it comes to fixing the information diets that we all consume, which is what you're talking about. One is that there is an element of individual media literacy, right? Like we do have to teach people how to process information. I've been seeing a lot of encouraging information or encouraging polling data recently about younger generations being a lot better at this. I mean, it makes sense, right? They grew up digital natives. They understand how to interpret the information they see online and what's real and what's not a lot better than some of the older generations where we really didn't grow up as much with the internet, and had to kind of learn it as we went. So I think there is going to be a little bit of a generational turnover, but I'm a big advocate for teaching children at a young age how to interact online, how to understand, the good and the bad of social, the good and the bad of news, understanding credible news sources versus news sources that might not be as credible. I think that kind of education is really, really important. So that's the first pillar. The other pillar is the platforms, the rails on which that information is delivered have to start taking some accountability for the environment in which the news actually is consumed. We saw polling data in the White House in 2014 that Facebook had become the #1 source of news in America. So it's been for a long time that digital news sources are where it's at when it comes to us digesting current events. But for a long time, they didn't want to admit that they had created these filter bubbles based on, like you said, economic incentives. They'd basically filtered out to where we were only getting what we wanted to hear, not what we needed to hear. It's still like that to a lot of extent. I think they're starting to do a little bit better in terms of both providing people with the tools to moderate, each other's content, but also putting a lot more effort in terms of the editorial side of what they do. I mean, you're seeing it right now with the Russia-Ukraine war and how they're choosing when and where to moderate information coming out about that war. It's been very fascinating as a case study. I think it's a lot easier to do that when there's like almost a clear black and white issue. It's a lot harder when you've got a domestic issue with political incentives on each side, and you have to kind of choose, and who am I going to anger today by taking this down or leaving this up? Like, it becomes a lot more messy, right? But they have to start taking responsibility as an editorial platform, not just as a tech platform that is, oh, we're neutral, we don't actually have any say. No, that's not. If you curate content, which all news feeds and all algorithms do, you have an editorial responsibility to how that content is curated. So that's one. And then because they've taken so long to actually take any responsibility, I think there has to be some government pressure and some government regulation. We have to, as a public, decide we have some of the most powerful companies in the world under our American umbrella. We have to decide how we are going to regulate those and how we are going to control what is essentially like a public utility. They don't want to call themselves a public utility, but they don't want to call themselves a media, like don't want to be regulated like a public utility, but also don't want to be regulated like a media platform. Right.
And yet they function almost as both.
That's what I'm saying.
Right.
Yeah. So like, cool. Let's create a third category. It's fine. We don't have to call you either of those things, but we can't continue with the status quo. So I think that's actually also coming. Like we've seen some movement in the regulatory space on that side too, both in Congress and in places like the FEC. So I'm hopeful. I think, again, it takes a long time to change the system that we're so entrenched with, especially the thing that I'm most afraid of, honestly, is that they have so much money that they can just keep throwing lobbying. Like the numbers of the lobbyists from these companies in DC over the past few years has just skyrocketed because of the regulatory pressure.
I'm like, there's so many questions that are like bubbling up in my head right now just from this. But Lamar, looks like you had one. So fire away, man.
Yeah. So, I mean, I'm considering, just the realization that a lot of these things, as big as they are, they're in their infancy stages. Mm-hmm. They're new. They're really just developing. They're figuring out what is, what's not. Over maybe the past 5 years, Facebook, Instagram, a lot of these media platforms are just now really starting to walk, so to speak.
Yeah.
And I think the hardest thing now, like you said, because you weren't there. So we'll use the parent term. You weren't there as a parent when these things were born, because you didn't see it was something that would even have an impact the way it did. Once it starts walking and it starts talking, and then it moves on to school and it's doing really well, now all of a sudden you have the interest, because now you want to claim, hey, we want to get involved in that, which is, it has its upside and downfall, its downfalls. But I think really approaching it from that position, understanding that it is the infancy stage, because I think people are taking a really hard line when it comes to trying to regulate and control, and also double-edged sword for good reason, because it is having a huge impact. It is impacting people, not just in the US as it initially probably was intended, but now you have people all around the world, and this is connecting in a way that is creating the environment of potential shifts in energy, shifts in the way that people communicate, shifts in potential battles, misinformation. So, I mean, that being said, what would you say would be a path forward in terms of really on the congressional side, understanding the infancy stages of this, and yet being able to kind of shift it and put the guardrails up so that it doesn't fall off the highway, so to speak?
Well, I mean, I think that's probably a question best left to people who are experts in regulation and lawmaking. But I think that it is funny as a mental exercise to think about a 200-plus-year-old democratic institution trying to govern a 15, 10-year-old tech company that is, has billions of users. Like, it's just our institutions were not built for this kind of problem, right? And they especially weren't built, to your point, about to move as fast as this problem needs in order to solve it, in a way that, before it becomes kind of out of control. So I'm happy it's moving as fast as it is, honestly. What the right answers are, I think there's lots of things we could potentially look at. I think that language around, if you're familiar with Section 230, which really provides a legal shield over user-generated content on the internet. People are looking at, are there ways to modify that? There's definitely something to be said for user privacy and regulation, like they've done in Europe. Like, they've done a lot in terms of data protections in Europe, some of which that's worked really well, some of which has been okay, in my opinion. There's a lot in terms of the advertising infrastructure that I would like to see change in terms of the incentives. I mean, part of the reason why we got into the space that we are in right now is because we've built our internet on the back of internet advertising, which requires eyeballs and which requires more and more engagement in order to justify spending money on it.
Right.
And so, the platforms are economically incentivized to keep you engaging, to keep you there so that they can keep selling the ad content. So if we can change the economic incentives, I think we could make a big dent in that somehow. I don't know if that's a regulatory issue or an actual, innovation or disruption, thing where somebody could come along and build a better model.
Right.
So who knows?
We do realize we're expecting you to have all the answers tonight.
I mean, I can BS and make stuff up all night. I think about this stuff all the time. Doesn't mean I have the right answers to it.
Yeah. But I think that's why we want to have these conversations is to what thoughts get out there, because you talk about digital infancy and growing pains. And I really love that analogy. And I think one of the things that we run into is we're also up against the conditioning towards instant gratification. So we've become used to, hey, you know what? I have a question. Boom. I can find the answer in 4 milliseconds. And so you're right. When these institutions have a certain amount of, a certain lack of, they're very resistant to this. We'll just say resistant to change. And so you're like running into a brick wall here and trying to, it's like, or maybe I should say it's like trying to turn an aircraft carrier around. Like, you just can't do it rapidly. And we're all zipping around in speedboats being like, I can do loops. Why can't you move this quickly? And it's because it's this monolithic institution that has so many moving parts. So we're up against sort of the instant gratification expectation versus the actual capability of the institution to actually enact change.
Yeah, I mean, that plays out in two different ways. It definitely plays out in terms of our expectation for how quickly institutions can move. not only in the government, like any institution, right? Like we expect everything to be solved overnight. Like that's the Amazon Prime effect, right? But the other really interesting application of the being able to get all of our information at once is this like expectation of certainty in our answers, right? Like that Google has this thing, I believe they call it like the 0 moment of truth or something like that. Like they want to have the right answer the moment you Google something, like boom, right there. And it's funny because it's gotten them in trouble with products like Google Home, where the search result won't necessarily be the truth, but it'll be the first thing that surfaced. So like in 2016, right after Trump was elected, there was this conspiracy theory going around about Obama overthrowing the government or like attempting a coup. And so if you asked Google Home, is Obama attempting a coup? Google Home would have said yes for a long time before it was corrected, because those were the most relevant search links. Isn't that funny?
Wow. I'd never even heard of that. That is fascinating.
Yeah. So, but that is a microcosm of a bigger problem, which is that we think we can find the answer to anything. And so if we have a problem, or if we have something, if we feel any kind of measure of tension or uncertainty, we go look for certainty. And on the internet, someone can be certain about just about anything.
Yeah.
Right. And so we can find certainty. We can find someone who believes they're right about just about any topic. But Bingo, it doesn't necessarily mean that it's right, capital R right, right?
Yeah. I love that. Just the search for certainty. Because I'm fascinated just by how the brain works as well. So I try to use my understanding of psychology to conceptualize why people do what they do.
I love that you're hitting on so many topics that I wrote about in my book. Like you're talking like the time expectation part, the like search for certainty, like these are whole sections that I wrote about. Love it.
Well, let's take a pause here and say you did write a book, and I believe it's on pre-order right now. Is that right?
Yes, pre-order. Very early stages, but yeah, you can go to Amazon, Bookshop, Barnes & Noble, any of those.
Is it called? I'm like, shoot, I should have wrote it down. No Plan B?
No Point B. Very close.
No Point B. Yeah. There we go. Okay. And so what is that in reference to? No Point B?
It's in reference to the idea that things are always going to be changing, and that we should just have an expectation that we are always going to be changing with them.
Right. So, we want this point A to point B, but there really isn't. It's like there's point A to, point infinity almost. Yeah,
exactly. Yeah. I mean, I'm just trying to make the case that we have to be comfortable in sitting in tension and always changing, both, as businesses, but also as people.
Yeah, it's fascinating because this is one of the things. So I work in the realm of weight loss and health transformation. And one of the things, there's a very interesting parallel, and that is, again, this expectation of instant gratification, instant results, and a real struggle to be comfortable with uncertainty and to be comfortable with discomfort, because actually, in order to create change, we have to sit in that place of discomfort. And I say my fear because I don't really know, I can't pin it down exactly, but I fear that we're sometimes losing a degree of resilience or the ability to be uncomfortable. And that comes from looking at, let's say, I look at the life of my grandmother, who was born in 1914, went through the Spanish flu pandemic, found her younger sister, 3-year-old, passed away. Of course, the World War I was happening at that time. She went through the Great Depression. She had her house burned down. She lived through World War II. She had her son drown. This is all pre-internet, with somewhat fun. And yet, if you met her, you met one of the most gracious ladies. I never heard her complain. There was just a sort of a resilience to, this was life. And I wonder if there's been an element of, we've been conditioned through social media, through media, through music videos. This is the life you deserve. This is the life you're entitled to. This is the life you should expect. You can be whatever you want to be. You can have whatever you want. And, on the one hand, I understand trying to inspire people to aspire to the best of their ability. But the flip side of that is it sets up a lot of unhappy people with a sense of maybe undeserved entitlement. I'm curious if what your thoughts are on that.
I think that you're getting at a critique of capitalism that is very popular right now, which is that it has ingrained in us messages that we are never enough, right? We always need to have better careers, more stuff, always be moving forward, never actually content with where we are. But I don't know. I think that's an interesting question. I don't know if that makes us if that is what makes us less resilient, as opposed to just we are living in a time of history where we are more comfortable and have more things and more access to information and more opportunities to self-actualize, whatever your definition of that is, and not actually be, buried down in those other parts of Maslow's hierarchy where we're just worried about survival every day. Right?
Yeah.
Like maybe we just have the brain space to be anxious and to worry about our purpose in a way that our ancestors never did. I don't know.
I think I wouldn't say opposite. Lack of choice of better words at the moment. I said I would think the opposite is probably possible. The fact that there is so much information that we don't have time to sit with anything. We don't have time to embrace the moment and be in the moment. So we become so mentally obese. We become so mentally full, and our minds become saturated to the point where we become numb. We're just numb to the things that go on. Something happens. In the moment, we feel this sense of sadness and maybe remorse. But then 3 minutes later, the next post is coming up, the next newscast is coming up, or something else where something else around the world is going on, or even in your own personal space. We just move on so quick.
Yeah.
One of the things personally for me was, I don't know, it just seemed like the grieving process of losing someone years ago was different, even now. And sometimes I wonder, am I holding on to something differently, or is the world just moving so much faster? Because I know, like, in that space, I have to allow it time to be in that emotion, feel it, let it sit, and then just really digest my environment after the absence of an individual who's been in my life for a number of years. And now it's just like, oh man, somebody died. We went, we cried, we said what we had to say. And then 2 days later, we're just moving. So I think that the society is just, we're just so information overloaded that we're becoming so numb. We're becoming, I think, even we're losing the ability to think, because we're being spoon fed. We're being bottle fed with so much information without having to study, without having to read. We'll get an audio book. And it's not to say that any of these things are bad, but I think just the fact that there are so many avenues for us not to have to be active, it creates that sense of just we move on and we don't really connect to anything.
Yeah, I was writing about this recently. I called it information collapse, like where we get all the world's information at once and we aren't really mentally prepared to handle it. Like, we're not meant to have so many crises we are all dealing with at once, like in our personal lives and in the world. And you're right, we are overstimulated, and we do have too many inputs, and none of them are bad. They don't have to be. Right? They're not all like bouncing games on our phone. Like, we're talking about issues that really matter and deserve our attention.
Right.
But like, we don't, like, it's a tragedy of the commons where they're all fighting for our attention at once, and we don't have the ability to, attention is a finite resource. Like, we don't have enough to give them.
Yeah. It's I'm just actually put through the link up here on to that blog post, the collapse of information. I think about the basically the availability of emotional anesthetic that maybe never really existed before. So whether it's alcohol, it's junk food, it's social media, it's video games, any form of digital entertainment, anything through our smartphone. So anytime we feel an uncomfortable emotion, we can go for a quick dopamine hit, and the accessibility of it is unprecedented. And ironically, I believe that desensitizes us, just from a neurological standpoint, desensitizes us to the effect of dopamine, such that our ordinary life begins to feel depressing. The absence of dopamine begins to feel like something is wrong in my life, when in fact, physiologically speaking, we can't be kept high all the time. Otherwise, this is exactly what happens. It's the same way that an addict requires a higher and higher quantity of the same substance to experience the same effect. I'm not necessarily directly trying to equate narcotic addiction to this, but there's definitely a parallel there where our brains are being affected in a negative way because of this. And I don't know that there's a good answer to it.
Yeah, there's definitely parallels. There's been studies that show that that there's addictive, behaviors, like you said, dopamine that we get from the swiping and scrolling that we do every day. It's addictive in ways that rewire our brains that we don't even realize.
So I wanted to use our current, or not our current, but your current press secretary is one of her favorite terms. I wanted to circle back to something here, and it's this idea, because we're touching on capitalism, some of the things that capitalism has given us, and there are some really good aspects to it. I'm not here to crap on capitalism necessarily as a system, but what we're observing is we see a lot of the capital, in the form of largely in money or in shares in companies and so on, piling up in one corner.
Yeah.
To the point that it's like, what do you do now? Because you now have power brokers that, again, they possess more power than nation states do. It's concentrated in the hands of, 100 people or less. How do we even, I don't know if fight that is the right word, but how do you not remove incentive to be innovative while still try to create some sort of equitable wealth distribution here, rather than all the money and the power that comes with it piling up in one corner?
I just think that the myth of wealth being an innovation incentive, well, let me say there is a degree to which success is an innovation incentive.
Okay.
But I reject the idea, this is my personal opinion, I reject the idea that we need billionaires or otherwise people won't be inventive. There are fewer small businesses created in the United States now than there were 20, 30 years ago. And, the tech sector, which is supposed to be this beacon of innovation, has been incredibly consolidated. And there are parts of the tech sector you can't even compete anymore because you'll get either swallowed up by the giants or run out of business by the giants. So like this, the money running into the hands of just a few people has been incredibly suppressive of innovation, I think. Whereas when we did spread out the game to lots more people around the economy, and you gave a lot more people the chance to get a leg up, we saw a lot more innovation. It just wasn't the 8 billion people or however many people are on one platform, it wasn't maybe wasn't the one sexy story that everyone wants to talk about, but it was a lot more, a groundswell of innovation, I think.
I would tend to agree with you on this. And you said a phrase. Now, what I thought you were going to say is we don't need billionaires, like full stop. And I was like, whoa. But
I mean, I think there's a moral argument to be made that people have made.
Right.
I think it's fascinating that is being a billionaire immoral in and of itself? I think
Right.
that's a separate conversation. But anyway, not to derail you.
No, because I've had those thoughts too. Like, do we want again to see that much sort of, I say power because I really, as we discover, like having this sort of wealth does, what's the word I'm looking for? It does endow someone with a certain amount of power, and then you're now an unelected individual in the population wielding more power,
Yes.
and you're
an American oligarch,
right? A disproportionate amount of power over public policy. And you think about, you mentioned like lobbyists that we have in Washington, and you think, for example, like big pharma. Look, there's been some great innovations, and I'm not one to necessarily knock it. I have a chemistry background, but I also look at there is the potential and the significant potential for abuse because there is now so much money. I'm just going to pick on that sector because it's probably hot button, and there's plenty of conspiracy theories that float around about that. But is there a way to get some of that money out of politics and maybe back into the hands of people that might actually benefit from it, rather than a select few benefiting from it?
Yeah, I mean there are specific ways. I mean, it could start with overturning our Supreme Court's decision about Citizens United, which made corporations on the same par as people, which I think is a historically terrible decision. Put a lot more money in politics. Trying to regulate that, I think there's campaign finance reform. There's a lot of levers of how, when you talk about money in politics, it looks like a lot of different things. So you have to kind of tackle it from a lot of different angles. But you need the political will in order to tackle it, which means that you need people running on those specific issues to have the license to actually tackle them.
Yeah.
what I found is that few people want to tackle infrastructure related kinds of problems like voting, money in politics, like the things that will make our system better. Finding the political will to do that is always harder than trying to find the political will to, do something that people are going to feel more immediate in their lives.
Now, is that because you get a 4-year term, and the reality is these projects take more than 4 years, and then if you go from, say, a Republican to a Democrat government, and there seems to be this, they're more interested in competing with each other than actually serving the people they were elected to represent. And I might be off the mark sometimes, but I get that impression. And so it's like, you can't really start something major when you know that you're not going to have the opportunity to finish it, and you dump a bunch of money into it only to have it. It's like building a bridge halfway across the river, and then you go, well, someone else got elected and doesn't want the bridge.
I mean, there's some truth to that for sure. I mean, like President Biden probably has a few more months left of political capital before, Congress realistically is going to switch hands. So, I mean, it's a structural thing. Like, not only is there political bandwidth, but the people in the seats that he needs to pass an agenda are about to change. But if you think about, I mean, that's a president. If presidents get 4 years, people in the House of Representatives only get 2. Like they are pretty much campaigning all the time, like all the time.
So in that case, and maybe the idea behind that design was to not allow power to be too concentrated, and yet ironically, it's now so disruptive when we actually need a degree of continuity in governance.
Yeah, I think there's some truth to that. I mean, I think that the people who designed the system never imagined the influence of political parties, for sure. Never imagined the influence of money, or at least money to this extent. So.
Yeah.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. Yeah, I mean, just from the founding fathers and the establishment of what was, you think about what they were leaving, what they were coming from, and they were trying to come out of their own form of oppression, and then coming here looking to create something that allowed them the freedom as they saw it. And it's hard. It's one of those things where government itself has to continue to evolve. And I think that's where the stalemate is coming. A lot of times there are things that are still present and still active that are not evolving in our system.
Yep.
And because it's not evolving, it's creating this almost potential tidal wave effect, because these things are not being addressed. And then ultimately you have an overflow of these things coming down and coming to head with what is now and what was then. So the traditions, of course, the traditions are important, and they are the things that made us, and they're the foundations. But you can't build a foundation on top of a foundation. Eventually, you have to build a house.
Yeah, I mean, the arguments that we have about tradition and in certain respects are so silly, considering how the founders wanted the government to be adaptable and to evolve. Like I read somewhere a few months ago about how, like, I think it was Jefferson, expected the Constitution to be amended a lot more than it actually has been, like a lot more often.
Yeah.
Anyway, so when we have arguments about the filibuster in the Senate and whether or not it should stay, even though it's only like a 50-year institution, or we have arguments about how many seats there should be on the Supreme Court, even though this number of seats on the Supreme Court has changed. It hasn't always been 9. Like, it becomes this asinine argument about tradition. And like, I can't believe you would ever defile the Senate. And it's like, the Senate's not meant to be, we're not supposed to serve the Senate. The Senate's meant to serve us.
Right.
So yeah, that's another fascinating thing. Yeah, it's like there's a question I'm trying to articulate or formulate, but there's actually like 6 running around in my head right now. You said that like Jefferson expected the Constitution to be amended many more times, and I couldn't even tell you as a trivia question like how many amendments the Constitution has. My guess would be 27, but I have no idea.
How many? I wish I knew this off the top of my head.
The only ones I ever seem to hear about are 1st, 2nd, and 5th, I think. No, 5th. Is that so? The first is which would be an interesting one. The free speech.
27. You're right.
Oh yes. First would be free speech, I believe, or not free speech. Sorry, freedom of speech. Is that the First Amendment or something connected to that? I feel like I hear people argue about that, probably on the opposite end of the political spectrum.
Yeah.
I don't know where I stand. I claim to be politically transcendent. Well, I'm going to steal from Kyle here and say, like, I want the systems of the right with the goals of the left and the freedom of the libertarians. That's
Good luck with that.
yeah. So, but this almost goes back to, I guess, touching on free speech, this idea of like social media curating content and the argument that they're curtailing free speech, or maybe there is. I mean, a case could be made for the potential to, through the process of curating content, I mean, not just maybe genuinely stifling speech, but like really dramatically changing a narrative from maybe what may be true. So the power doesn't mean it's going to be used, but the power exists to shape, I don't know if we should say false narratives, but narratives to fit a particular slant, depending which way that media conglomerate leads. Is that a potential risk of saying we should be curating speech?
I mean, I think that anyone who says that social media is curating what can be said on their platforms is a violation of free speech. I'm just going to call bullshit on that, because the First Amendment is meant to protect citizens from governments, not citizens from private companies making editorial decisions. So
Right. Okay.
if CNN, if Fox News, if MSNBC can decide what they run on their platform and what they don't, and we're not calling free speech on them, obviously, because they make editorial decisions every single day about what they believe is the most important thing to serve their audiences, internet companies should be able to make the same kinds of editorial decisions, and they should make, in my opinion, the same kinds of editorial decisions. The only reason why we say things like free speech whenever they make those kind of editorial decisions is because they are so big and they are so powerful and they feel so much like a public utility, but they're not a public utility. If they were a public utility, if they were run by a government entity, it would be a completely separate conversation. We would be able to have a free speech argument, because it would be literal government oppression if you weren't allowed to say particular things on that entity. But if you are a company with shareholders meant to protect the interests of your customers and your shareholders, you can make those kind of decisions. And people are just going to have to deal, and they're going to have to make a consumer-driven decision to go elsewhere if they don't like it.
It was well articulated. I didn't have any horse in that race, but I was kind of curious about it because I guess again, because I'm Canadian, like the whole we don't get to carry around guns. Well,
that's right. Yeah. You don't get to throw the First Amendment or Second Amendment in my face like conservatives typically do.
Well, and so I mean, because we haven't even asked about Obama, I am curious about that, and I want to be respectful of your time. But if you have a little bit of time, I'd love to just because you might have kids to put to bed. Okay.
Oh no, they're already in bed at this point. My wife's just waiting. She's got to go to bed soon. She's a teacher. She gets up early. She's about to crash. Okay, so maybe last hard question, unless you got one more, Lamar, and that's just like media corporate corruption is a note that I wrote down, and I think what I'm trying to get to here is like, let's say the legacy media is beholden to those who pay the bills in a sense, and so you go back to the companies that have the most money, can buy the most advertising, wield the most influence, have the potential to shape a narrative. I think that's a potential risk we have in the communication sphere. Is there a way to mitigate that risk? Yeah, I mean, I think that's been a problem historically in a lot of newsrooms, right? The wall that's supposed to be up between the advertising and the revenue side of newsrooms and the editorial side of newsrooms is not always as clean as we would like it to be. And I think that's why I get a lot of my news from places like NPR, National Public Radio in the United States, for example, because they are publicly funded and partially funded, but mostly publicly funded by the government, mostly publicly funded by individual users, but partially with some government funding as well. I think that's a really interesting model for public news, something that's supposed to serve the public interest, actually being funded by the public.
Right.
It's a crazy concept. But, I think that dichotomy of corporate influence on the news can be seen in places like, Fox News in ways that have been arguably, especially on the progressive side, good. Like if you actually look at an organization like Sleeping Giants, I don't know if you've heard of Sleeping Giants. They have done an incredible targeted campaign at Fox News's advertisers, basically like taking clips of things that people like Tucker Carlson will say and tweeting them back at the advertisers of that program and being like, is this where you want your money going? So they actually take that public pressure on the advertiser with the content from that media organization to try to undermine the media organization by going directly at the money. So, you could make an argument like it's been used for good and for evil, I guess is what I'm saying in terms of the corporate influence.
Did I hear correctly that Tucker Carlson is like the most watched guy in, or what, I don't know what you call him. Is he a storyteller, but I mean, there's got to be, he has some he has a show, and it seems like
talking head pundit. Yeah.
Okay, there we go. Is he like the most watched talking head in the US?
Yeah, but I mean, most watched in terms of who watches cable news in general, small audience so most people who watch cable news, Fox has the biggest audience.
Okay.
Of the people who watch talking heads, Tucker Carlson has the biggest audience. But we're talking about, I think I heard at one point, I might be way off at this, but I think I heard at one point maybe he gets an audience of like a few, like 1 million people a night on a good night, if I remember right.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Whereas, a good clip going viral on social media can get 10 million viewers, like it's
right.
The scale of people who actually watch cable news is still relatively small from an influence standpoint. It's been very concentrated on the right in our country in the last 10 years, 20 years.
It's funny because I would think like both your compared to what we have up here, both your political parties feel like they're actually right leaning, or in the extent that they're like.
I hear that. Yeah.
So, because in my head, I'm like, I would have loved to see someone like Andrew Yang be taken seriously, because you have, and I don't know if he had the best political platform, but I guess what I saw in him as young, obviously he's savvy in business. He's tech savvy, future looking. Like there's so many good qualities you could maybe find in a leader. Now I'm certainly not qualified to evaluate his actual platform. I was just looking at his attributes as a potential leader of the country.
Sure.
And go, I thought like he would have been more popular, for example, because of, versus say a geriatric who's always been in public office for 50 years. And things are getting a little stale here. Why wouldn't we want somebody who's young and future and forward looking?
There are a lot of factors that go into making that kind of decision in terms of like what the infrastructure of our political parties, for example, and how hard it is to actually win a primary.
Fair enough.
Yeah.
Like as an outside observer, it sounds just so easy. I'm like, why don't you just get this guy? He's really smart. He knows how to make money, but he's also has a social conscience, and he's a tech innovator looking future forward. Seems like a great decision to run your country, but
yeah, that's a longer conversation.
Yeah. So just
I looked it up.
Go ahead, Terry.
Tucker Carlson gets like 3 million viewers a night.
Okay. Yeah. But I mean,
but
look,
again, Katy Perry has more followers than that on Twitter. Like, so by of scale,
Yeah. So now this is just to indulge my curiosity, and Lamar, you're welcome to dive in here too. You spent some time as Barack Obama on Twitter, so you were like tweeting for him. How did you decide like what to tweet, like, and how much, like, did you get regular? I mean, how much interaction did you actually get with President Obama in order to fulfill that role?
Well, as you can imagine, the president was very busy.
Yeah.
Not
trying to change the world.
Not a lot. In fact, we had an editorial team. We had writers. We had publishers of people that I managed. And for the most part, I'd say 80% of the content that we produced, they wrote it. We did peer review, so other people would read it. I would read it. And then I would give it a green light, and it would go live. So, we had a pretty fast production cycle for content, and things would go live without a lot more approval other than me, which was, I wasn't as gray before I started that job. And now I'm had a
Neither
lot
was
of
Obama.
restless
I
nights.
think everybody who comes out of that building has that story.
That's what I'm saying.
Well, I wanted to throw some joke in there, but Trump didn't have all those filters.
Yeah, I would say that it was weird how much consideration we gave and how much care we took with things like spelling that the next president didn't care very much about.
Yeah.
Anyway, but yeah, I mean, a lot of it was, I'd say it was a combination of issues and campaigns that we cared about, like what was on the president's agenda, what was on his plate, what was he trying to push domestically, especially, and then what was in the news cycle, right? Like what did he have? What did he not expect to have on his plate that he now had on his plate that he had to react to? And sometimes it meant that we would, follow his lead in terms of what he was doing day to day. Sometimes it meant we would go quiet or like step back and let the president do his job before we, gave him a point of view on Twitter he didn't necessarily have yet, for example. So it's a lot of very fast decision making, or going live, shutting things down, that had to happen every day.
Stark contrast.
Yeah.
Yeah. Just in terms of, I guess, the platform itself, Twitter, I know a lot of times, and again, this is kind of getting more into the expectation and what we talked about earlier in terms of the expectation that people have on presidents in general, and probably Barack Obama more specifically.
Yeah.
Especially, I think there was this expectation culturally for him to do certain things, I guess, because, what do you do when you have a black man in office?
Sure.
Like, okay, what is supposed to happen now? So he's there, and he's there to do a job. And I think culturally there was not that total understanding. I think there was an expectation of reparations to some degree, and not reparations in the way we talk about it, but just like, look, there are some things that are hurting and we need to be repaired. And we feel like you being in office will be the one to look at these things that culturally we may be feeling. And then a lot of people ended up feeling like they were not heard. So in terms of that, was there ever a time where maybe a direct interaction, or just like you said, from observation, where something like that you can recall was addressed, or that was a specific challenge in particular in terms of putting out content to pretty much to the world and to the country?
The only time, I mean, I think you're landing on something that the president struggled with a lot, especially in his second administration, when he wasn't having to run for office again, and he could be a little bit more reflective on, how he wanted to end his presidency. The times that I'm thinking about are when Trayvon Martin was killed, when there were some pretty high profile shootings of black kids. It was really, we're in a time where the country was kind of calling out for him to be a leader and to provide a point of view and to provide some reconciliation. I think those were the moments where he really shined, but especially, the Trayvon Martin killing, he could actually speak from the experience of being a black man too, and actually like tap into that in a way that, no other president could have done.
Yeah. And I can only imagine how difficult that is, because again, understanding you're there to do a job. At the same time, you're touched by a community who's being impacted by certain things that are happening. And like, I can only imagine just to walk that fine line to not do, I guess, what the opposition would expect, which would be almost taking a side, would paint a picture of potentially being a racist because you sided with somebody who represents you. So I can only imagine. Yeah.
I mean, to a certain extent, the presidency is all the president is always a moral leader, always a cultural leader, and not just, an executive leader. but I definitely think there was extra pressure on him as the first president of color, like to actually hold the office, to speak from his identity more than other presidents had. I think he and I think to another extent, in a different context, Michelle really took those roles very seriously.
Yeah.
Didn't always get it right. I don't think they would claim that they always got it right, but at least were very self-reflective and intentional about it.
Right.
Well, I think it's not really fair to throw that on their shoulders and say you have to hit the mark every single time. And when sort of with anybody else, we would show them some grace and go, hey, look, you're human. As long as we know you're doing the best you can, I think we can tolerate an honest mistake. And I think tolerate's probably even sounds too harsh. We can live with an honest mistake if we know the intent is there and is good.
Right. For anyone else.
Yeah. So, well, Caleb, I still have a long list of questions, but I really, really respect your time, and I so much, we're a small show, so I was really pleased when you were open to coming on and joining us for this conversation. It's been an absolute pleasure. You've had so many wonderful insights. I'd love for people to learn, if they want to know more about you, where can they find you?
Yeah, you can find all about me at calebgardner.com. You can, follow me on all the social. I'm probably too easy to get a hold of online because of all the social accounts I spend on every day. But you can follow me there. You can, if you go to calebgardner.com/books, you can see the links to pre-order No Point B. And yeah, it's been great chatting with you both. I mean, this has been super fun.
Yeah,
definitely. I definitely
Chris, you missed out.
I know she's going to be, well, it's not that she's going to be kicking herself. I understand that the parenting, I'm glad that parenting comes first with her as well. But I feel, we might have to invite you back if you'd be open to it. If I can get, Chris to show up for this conversation, or you know what, I'll just connect the two of you and say, hey, fly at her, because, and I want to be a fly in the wall, just listening to that conversation. And once you get chatting with her, I think you'll understand why. So, so thank you so much for taking the time to join us. It's been an absolute pleasure.
Yeah, thank you so much for the invite. It's been fun.
Pleasure. Have a good night, everyone, and thanks for joining us.
We've created a foundation of basing who we are on the response we get from people. People are expressing to somebody else out of the dislike maybe for themselves. When you can respond with compassion, you've learned to develop a certain amount of love and respect and appreciation for yourself.
Compassion allows us to look at these things and to see them as they are, with a desire to understand without the need to judge. And in that space, that's where we create powerful transformational change.